Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 15th of March 2021. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytic here. Great to have you on board. And we're going for a good show tonight. Just before I bring our guests in, let me just remind you, as I always do, that we don't provide specific legal or financial advice on the channel. We do moderate the stream. This is as at the 15th of March. If you'd like to ask a question or get my attention, use @WalkTheWorld. That's the best way to make sure that your question comes through to me. And I've also enabled Super Chat, so if you'd like to get your question top of the list, you can do that, or indeed make a contribution to the show. And without further ado, let me bring in both Victor and Steve. Victor, hello, are you there? I'm good. Let's see if I can bring you in. Hang on, let's just do that. There we go. Right. Hi. Can you see me and hear me all right?
I can.
Jolly good. And Steve, are you there?
Yep.
Okay, great.
So bring me in, okay.
Yeah. So it switches when you speak, so it'll just take a second to come through. Well, great to have you both on. And look, there's so much I want to talk about. Victor, can I just start with you? Because we had our first conversation well over 6 months ago, and you know the New Liberals was pretty much a nascent concept there. It's moved on from strength to strength. So just give us a quick headline update as to where the New Liberals currently is.
Well, we're actually looking good in about, there's two lower house Queensland seats where we are leading in the polls. So there's a real chance that we can take those two Queensland seats. There's also a South Australian seat where we haven't got a polling, but we're pretty sure our candidate is right up there with the incumbent Liberal. And my own seat of North Sydney that I'm contesting, we're still a bit of a long shot because it's a very tough seat. There's a lot of well-funded people running in North Sydney. It's a key seat. But we're sort of coming up all the time and they're going down. So we've got about 8 weeks to go. So fingers crossed, if everything goes well and we have a bit of luck, I might get up in North Sydney as well. And so if all that happens, we would have 4 people elected to the lower house, which would be history-making. No party first time round has ever had anybody elected to the lower house, let alone 4. So that's the possibility, and we're very excited. A lot can happen between now and then. We could get no one elected or 10 people elected, but that's where it stands at the moment, and it certainly could be a lot worse than that.
Oh, that's good, and certainly come a long way since we first had a chat. And Steve, where are you at the moment?
Well, I'm trying to get engaged at the Senate level, but the confusion, I might as well put this out on the bench straight away. Everything, the old story, everything happens at once. Well, I've got a house sale I've got to go through. I had a prostate cancer diagnosis, and I'm currently waiting to see whether I have COVID or not. So that's sort of stemming my capacity to campaign somewhat, and Victor and I have a bit of a chat about this. I'm going to do the best I can. I've got a website which I'd like people to take a look at called Keen for the Senate, having a bit of fun playing with my surname. So keenforthesenate.com. And putting forward the sort of policies I'd like to put forward when I get there. I'll do the very best I can, but it's rather harder to campaign at the Senate level, as we always recognised. Victor was always saying that I've got to really expect to ride on the coattails of the lower house candidates. The thing I need to organise, and this is a bit of appeal to anybody out there who likes the approach that I take to economics and the focus I have on climate change, I need people to hand out how to vote cards. And when you're looking at the House of Reps, you have 40 polling booths per seat. You'd want to have 120 to 160 people helping you out on the day. By 50 times 40, that's 2,000 polling booths for the Senate, which is one hell of a large number. So I've got on my website, I have a volunteer button, and I'd be delighted if people who would like to see a bit of intelligence in the Senate would click on that volunteer, and hopefully we'll get some people handing out leaflets and improve the odds in the seats where we don't have a lower house candidate.
The concept of intelligence in the Senate, that sounds rather attractive.
Yeah. Bit of an oxymoron, isn't it?
It is, but no, it's pretty important. Well, look, I've got a whole bunch of questions that came in beforehand, and there's some coming on the stream now. So without further ado, let's get into it. Steve, I think the first one might come your way. Housing affordability and RBA policy, right? What we know is that the house price data from the ABS today was remarkably strong. Essentially, this is the chart which showed that basically it's over 26% up till December. One of the strongest growth spikes ever, and we also know that housing affordability has deteriorated dramatically. The question I've got for you is, what's caused this big spike? Clue, RBA?
Not so much. I think what's actually caused it is the Treasury, and that is because the necessary element of surviving the coronavirus, forced on governments whether they wanted to or not, was to run a huge deficit. And one thing which modern monetary theory argues, and that's something which the party accepts, is that the government's deficit is the private sector's surplus. So you've had a huge cash injection into the public. That's one reason why the recovery from the COVID recession was so much faster than any previous recession, especially, of course, the 2008 downturn. If we'd had a scale of government spending like we had this time around last time, there would have been effectively no recession, as there was in Australia. And that implies that people are now using that money to lever up their speculation on the housing market. They can't travel. They've got a huge injection of cash. They can go to the bank with a larger deposit. It seems I think that's actually what kick-started the increase in house prices this time round. I hadn't thought about it beforehand. When you look at the numbers, the increase in prices during a pandemic, the only feasible explanation is that the scale of government spending has given people money where they're no longer buying on goods and services. They're still buying on travel and personal services. So bang, the money goes towards the deposit for the housing, and then off goes the housing boom, and that sets off the whole dynamic. Now, the RBA has assisted this by dropping rates and ignoring the level of private debt throughout. And this is, we're being pushed into a corner where the level of private debt will be probably the highest in the world. The only one higher than us is Switzerland. And we've seen recently some information about you can't trust Swiss numbers on money. It's still the gnomes of Zurich behaviour. So we're probably at the highest level of household debt in the world, and that, I think, is the trap we're facing, because if there is an increase in rates, then the impact on people's leverage is dramatic, because we're carrying, in terms of a ratio of debt to GDP, private debt to GDP, 6 times the debt ratio that applied in the 1980s. So the rate rise is now, therefore, 6 times as impactful on people's budgets. And this could be where we start seeing that price rise start to fall over. And we'd rather have an orderly decline in house prices than a disorderly decline.
And there's just a couple of points to add there. First, of course, no migration over the last couple of years, so you can't blame foreign buyers, right?
No.
The first one. The second one is, of course, the average loan over the last 2 years has gone up by more than 20%. The average new loan, right? So people are leveraged to the hilt. The third point to add is that there's more than 50 billion that's been pulled out in terms of refinancing from the equity to fold back in. So that's another factor, which is why the debt's so high as well. So I guess the question is, this is clearly a policy failure, a long-term policy failure, and it's laid bare by what's happened over the last couple of years. And yet, go on.
Yes, you keep going. I'll come in.
And yet, all of the conversation at the moment from government is on the supply side. Haven't built enough. We need to build more. Which isn't really getting to the core issue, is it?
No, it's not. The core issue is debt. The core issue is the level of leverage. And actually, is it possible to share screen? You give me the right to share the screen?
Yeah, just 1 second. Let me just... this is all a bit ad hoc because I wasn't expecting you. Go right. If you share the screen, I will then can switch you...
I'm going to share just a window here. I don't know how this is going to. I haven't tried doing it. Can you see that
there you go.
chart on screen?
Yep, charts on screen.
Okay. That's my long-term analysis of what actually drives house prices. And what drives house prices is accelerating levels of mortgage debt. And the logic is quite simple. I'll go back up and show an earlier chart. This is the level of household debt around the world, leaving out Switzerland. which because Switzerland's data, as I said, there's so much money laundering in the Swiss system that the debt levels don't really make sense in terms of paying back to. It looks like a lot of the debt is actually people using private debt in Switzerland is a form of corporate debt as well, rather than being used just for house prices. But there we have the highest level of private debt in the world. And if you look at the pattern, I was going to go back down a bit here. You look at the pattern of change in house prices versus change in new mortgage debt. That's the correlation. You can see the takeoff in credit. The red line, and the blue line, which would now be extended further, is the change in house prices on an annual basis. So it's increasing credit driving up house prices, and that's been happening, way back, right from 1980 all the way through. The whole thing has been driven by allowing the banks to lend too much money, too irresponsibly, for buying houses, and that's what's caused the house price bubble.
It's so obvious, isn't it, when you see it correlated like that, Steve?
Yeah, and you can't see it unless you do correlate.
Yeah.
When you look at the actual household data and house price data, you get a pattern for America, which is very different to Australia. Everybody knows, of course, America had a house price crash in 2008. Now the house prices are recovering again. And if you look at them, you say, well, it's a totally different pattern to Australia. Must be a different explanation. If I can just actually go back and share screen again, and do the same window, this is the American data. Okay. And it's the same pattern.
Yes.
So very, very, I haven't actually got on this. This is my keen for the Senate website that we're explaining our affordable housing policy, and I don't actually have the, on that page, I don't have the chart of total debt, total household debt, and index of house prices. But if you look at them and look at the Australian and American, you can't make sense of it. There's no comparison. Yes, there is when you dive down. You've got to go a second level in terms of rate of change of debt. And that's I've done the logic behind it. It's a causal argument, and the statistics confirm it. This is what drives house prices. We've got to stop banks doing irresponsible lending if we want to stop house prices rising.
Yeah, and that is the rate of change of credit is the critical thing. And if you go back over the last year, what's happened is that house prices have gone up a lot because credit's gone up a lot.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, the APRA data came out today to show that there's been a significant rise in home lending credit. The other thing that they showed was that a higher proportion than ever is now above 6 times debt to income ratio.
Yeah.
Right? So leverage to the hilt.
Yep. And what you're seeing, of course, is now people saying, why don't you access your superannuation to pay for it? And why don't you get a loan from bank and mum and dad? And what it means is eventually the finance sector owns. Can I use French on this program?
Yeah, feel free.
The French owns fucking everything.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
It is a takeover by the finance sector, and we continue ignoring it and saying that's all about the supply side. And the thing is, you cannot supply housing fast enough to balance it. Like you can supply more bananas. If the market for bananas, get a rising price, then dump some bananas on the market. You can grow them relatively quickly. You can't grow houses anything like that speed. So even if you use the conventional, intersecting supply and demand curve way of thinking the mainstream does, because you say the supply curve is very inflexible, therefore it's changes on the demand side that determines prices rise or fall. So you've got to affect the demand side. I think we're the only party that's actually saying that, and we want to say it loud and clear. We want to maintain household equity. We don't want house owners to suffer. I'm not quite so sympathetic about landlords, but home owners. We want to maintain the equity they've got while bringing house prices down, because there is no such thing as affordable, expensive housing.
That's an oxymoron again, isn't it? Affordable, expensive housing. I mean, and it's interesting, of course, that a lot of the construction sector are lobbying again for more incentives from government to try and actually encourage more building and more pull forward. Nobody wants to touch the debt bomb, as it were, right?
Yeah,
because
we do.
Yeah,
we want to disarm the bomb of debt.
Exactly. And that's why this is such an important conversation, right? Because the fact of the matter is that unless you deal with the debt issue, right, this is not going to actually change anything. We're just going to get more and more and more deeply. And it's also worth noting the average loan is now 30 years rather than 25 years.
Right? There we go. When are the 99-year mortgages going to come out?
Exactly right.
The Japanese mortgages from 1980s.
So you are basically a cash flow, and you will pay until the end of your life, and you probably still have a mortgage when you die, right? I mean, that's ultimately where you get to. So what's the difference between that and renting?
Well, in renting, you know who your landlord is. That's about the only difference.
Yeah, exactly right. Now, Victor,
your landlord's not as much of an asshole.
Right. Now, Victor, can I come to you? Because there is a housing affordability policy as well that we need to talk about, right? And it's interesting that there's been a lot of talk about housing affordability and how we help more people to get in. So how do you think about that as part of this, this overall conversation?
Well, I mean, I don't want to give Steve too much work to do, but I mean, he has authored our housing affordability policy. So rather than me do a layman's botch job, I think maybe I'll throw it back to Steve to talk about what we plan.
Yeah, but just before you do, let me sort of make the point though that clearly there has to be a policy around housing affordability as part of the suite.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
and that's what we have.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So Steve, let me come back to you then, and maybe we can just unpack the housing affordability part of the story.
Yeah. Well, the basic. Actually, again, I'll do a bit of screen sharing here if I can, because this is stuff where I want people to read this document. So this is the motive. Hang on, I don't want. No, yes, I'm extremely likely to recommend it open. Now get out of the way. Okay. This is ABS data from the census on the breakup of the population according to whether they own their home, whether they own their home with a mortgage, whether they're renting from a private landlord or they're renting from the public. And of course, we all know that the objective of government policy, whether you're looking at Liberal or Labor, has always been to improve household ownership. Well, what a raging success it's been. We've gone from 43% of people owning their homes outright back in 1989 down to 31% in 2018. It'll certainly be lower now. You can extrapolate the trend forward. Those owning with a mortgage have gone from 30% to 38%, 37%. Again, that would be rising again right now. Those renting has gone from 18%, the lower 16%, to 27%. That's also obviously risen. And of course, there's been a decline in the houses offered by the public sector for rental. So everything we've been doing has achieved the exact opposite of the objectives of the policy. And we're saying, it's actually looked up, of course, Einstein did not say doing the same thing and expecting a different result is the definition of madness, but it's nonetheless true. And that's what we've been doing. So if you look at what's happened all the way through, these sorts of policies have all been to increase the amount of money given to first home buyers. You had the first home owner scheme, and it's what do they call in America? Bipartisan. They're both stuffing it up. So Labor begins with the first home owner scheme. Labor brings in negative gearing. Then you have another first home scheme. Then the Liberals halve the capital gains tax. Then Howard doubles the home owner scheme, extends it for an extra decade. It took us a decade to get over GST. Did you know that? And then you then have the doubling and trebling by Rudd, and then Morrison brings in the loan deposit scheme 1 and scheme 2. Everything has been throwing money at the buyers, and of course what the buyers do is go to the bank with more money and lever up the amount, even more money levered up by the banking sector. And of course we even had an inquiry into housing, into banking behaviour. And what was the result of that? The recommendation was to restrain irresponsible lending, and the outcome was say, let's encourage irresponsible lending. So we've got to stop doing this. And that's what we're talking about. And here's the mortgage debt situation. You look at personal debt, that's barely changed over 50 years, okay? As a percentage of GDP, not much change at all. All the increase in household debt has been an increase in mortgage debt. And then when you do the ups and downs I showed a while ago, this is actually the comparison of America versus Australia. Real house prices, very different pattern. America boom, a boom, bust, and then a bit of a boom again. We've just been continuously booming. The level of household debt, they went up and came down. We've been just going up and slowly starting to taper. But when you look at the pattern that I've shown you, that change in debt and change in house prices, the same correlation, the same causal story. So we've got to reduce the level of household debt. That's the zero. and our housing affordability policy is twofold. It'll reduce the level of household debt that current households have. We want to get back from the days of household debt being, as it is now, 120% of GDP, back what was in the 70s of about 20% of GDP. So reduce the burden on the household sector. Don't let the banks lend that much anymore. Maintain household equity we reduce household debt and also reduce house prices to make it possible for people who are renters to actually buy, because, hey, it's easier to buy when the prices fall when then they rise.
And the point there is, Steve, that that's going to benefit households. It won't benefit the banks, though, will it?
Well, this is I've been working on the idea of a modern debt jubilee for decades now, or at least a decade. And the idea, I'll go back to visual again before I hit that particular issue. But the whole story was, we know that what's actually happened is, because of the paranoia about government debt, you still need a growing amount of money for a growing economy. And so the private sector has borrowed from the banking sector to make up effectively for the lack of government money creation. And then the way that money is being distributed is not to finance productive investment, new capital goods, et cetera, it's to pass prices. So the real cause of the growing money supply that the economy as a whole needs, if it's going to grow, has come from the house price bubble. And that is just a crazy way to run an economy. So we're going to say, let's reduce. What it means is most of the money that exists in Australia has been created by banks lending for a house price bubble. So we want to reduce the amount of money that is backed by credit and increase the amount of money that is backed by government fiat. And the idea is to use the government's capacity to create money, to make an injection into everybody's bank account, same amount of money per capita across the entire society. And with that injection, anybody who has debt has to pay the debt down. So you reduce the debt of everybody who's got a mortgage by the per capita amount everybody gets. Those who don't have debt can get the government bonds that are created to not to finance that, but to resource the extra reserves that are created by the whole process. So I explain the logic in the policy document, and the key point that people have to appreciate is that just as banks create money by lending out more than they get back in deposits, governments create money by spending more than they tax. Now, when the banks create money, what they create on the asset side is more private debt, which is their asset for the banking sector, and that's what means they've got the housing sector by the short and curlies over that. When the government does it, it increases reserves. Okay. Now, reserves are an asset of the banking sector that earns no money for the banking sector. So when the bonds are sold, they're bought using the reserves that are created by the deficit. And that effectively gives the banks a return, because if they just have the reserves, then they can't trade the reserves and they don't get interest on reserves. When they buy the bonds, with the money, with reserves created by the deficit, they get a tradable asset that earns an interest payment. And in effect, you can regard the bond as being a way of paying the banks for the service of maintaining the banking sector. So what we would do is the banks would have a drop in their loan assets, an increase in their reserves, and then you sell them bonds which earn 3%. We bring back sensible interest rates again. And so that 3% effectively finances the cost of the banking system, the whole, branch and deposit account system that the government retains. And if you go back to the 50s and 60s, and my father was a banker back then, so this is family law, the role of the banks were boring. Okay, if you're a bank manager, you were somebody, a nice person who's boring and does the right sort of thing. You weren't somebody trying to sell you, rocket ships to Mars in terms of level of leverage. And the banking was described as a 3-6-3 business. And they got the logic wrong, because the banks don't borrow this, but there's also borrow at 3, lend at 6, and be on the golf course by 6 o'clock. Now that's a much more practical use for a banker than trying to be masters of the bloody universe.
Absolutely. As you say, banking should be boring rather than what it is at the moment. Okay, well, we'll point people to that particular document, which is again on your website, to Steve, and it's worth a read if people want to get into the more detailed nuts and bolts of the policy. But it's a very powerful policy, and the point is it's a holistic policy. And I don't think there's any other party that's got the whole story.
No, I mean, the other ones still come back and say, let's increase the supply. That's always the story. Everyone is saying supply. Well, that's been the suggestion for 30 years.
Yes.
Let's just do the Einstein thing and keep on doing the same thing and expect a different result. Okay. So we're going to say, let's actually take that advice, and let's, rather than trying to boost the supply side, let's reduce the demand side, but do it in such a way that the average household homeowner does not have a fall in their equity. So we want to bring the house prices down. Let's be frank about that. We want house prices to fall, but they're too expensive. People can't buy into the market, and we're seeing, there are plenty of people who know their kids are buying in Newcastle and Bathurst rather than buying in Sydney because they simply can't afford to buy in Sydney. They're being driven out of the market. You've got to bring the prices down so the average Australian can afford to buy a home. That's essential. But you want to do it so that the debt with the house prices coming down, so does the debt. And the people who have debt end up with less debt, lower house prices, but therefore the same equity in the house. And in fact, they're closer to repaying the house than they would be without our policy.
Yep, powerful thinking. All right, let's move the conversation forward. Victor, I'd like you to come in on this one. This is actually a question from Pippa. And she basically talks about, this is about the flood. The recent flood response looks a bit flaky. What's your view? But also, what does it tell us about climate and the politics around climate?
Yeah, Pippa, that's a great question. I think it is flaky because the business of government is not looking after the people anymore. The business of government is the business of government and making money and negotiating with your donors and so on. So when there's so that sort of lack of care, which applies across all sectors of society, but because it's usually the boiling frog syndrome and they get away with it, suddenly gets thrown into a highlighted state when there's a traumatic disaster like the flood. So they don't do a good job, and my great worry is that we already have massive homelessness. We have 3.2 million below the poverty line. I forget the exact figure, but I think about 800,000 people are sleeping rough, out on the streets, homeless. And, it's fascinating. I'm actually, believe it or not, I'm campaigning in the fourth most affluent seat in Australia, so-called North Sydney. And so I'm going around, I'm on the hustings every day, and we're setting up our little stall, at all the various parts of the electorate. And wherever I go in this affluent electorate, there are homeless people, right? So I go and chat to them, and buy them a coffee and get to know them. And the fascinating thing is that not one of these people is some drug addict, some alcoholic, some person who, has driven themselves. And what it usually is some unfortunate turn of events, which in the past would have been caught by the fine safety nets we have in this country. And there are no good safety nets anymore. And these people find themselves out on the street. So that's going to apply too. Like there's how many thousands of people are now without homes up in Lismore, for example. A lot of those people are going to end up homeless just because of a natural event. Well, it's not a natural event. That's the wrong choice of words. It's an event fueled by climate change. And nothing will be done for them any more than it's done for the person whose mother was sick and they had to take care of them and they lost their job, and then the mother died and the house was repossessed and they found themselves on the street. It's going to happen to those people up in the flood-ridden areas. And that'll all be brushed under the carpet too. Because so long as you've got 22 million people who aren't homeless, then the 3 million people who are homeless can maybe not matter. So I wrote to the opinions editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, and I said, I would like to write an opinion piece for you on this very fact that we have close to 1 million homeless people, and this natural disaster is going to add to that homelessness, and that the 1 million people who are homeless are unnecessarily homeless, and these extra people will be unnecessarily homeless too. And the response I got was, no, we don't have room for an article like that. Well, if you don't have room for an article like that, what do you have room for? People, I mean, it's just so, they say that in the French Revolution, you had to get to the point where 40% of the population was starving before people took to the streets and did something about it. Here we've only got, 12% of the people starving. So we're a long way from revolution. So, as for the politics of climate change, I mean, the one thing that seems to be a constant, again, and this is anecdotal stuff from out on the hustings, but, we're talking to the people every day. These are not theoretical things. These are statements from the people. Is that people who understand the effect of climate change understand it well and understand that it is a very dangerous thing and that we're in a climate emergency. But the people who deny that, look, honestly, the Lord God could come down and slap them in the head with a burning ember and say, this is climate change right here, and they'd say, no, it isn't. Right. So nothing. I felt that the situation in New South Wales, where we had the fires and then we have the floods, and they're all extreme, and it's the worst flood in. There's a wonderful statement that they have now, where they express as the worst flood in 5,000 years and stuff like that. I mean, you would think that would get people who were in climate denial thinking again, but the nature of denial is that they will deny as the molten lava is sucking them down. So those who want to play on that, people like Clive Palmer and so on, I don't think they're losing a supporter. It doesn't matter how many floods or famines or fires or locusts there are.
So it's interesting because the IPCC report came out a couple of weeks ago, right? And basically, I've never read a report from such an august organisation that was so strong on, you guys have to take this seriously, right? Because we've got a very limited window now to do anything, and the chances are it's already too late. But I mean, it got swamped out with the war in Ukraine and everything else, and people are just carrying on as normal. At what point does it get so bad that essentially, people take it seriously? Or is your point that really until you get 40%, completely mown over by it, nothing's going to change?
I think that's right. Unfortunately, I think that's right. What we're finding across the board with all our policies, because we're looking at these desperate problems that our democracy is facing, like the climate emergency, like the incredible corruption in government, like the 3.2 million people who are homeless, like the absolute unaffordability of housing for young people. And we come out with policies like Steve Keen's wonderful affordable housing policy. But because you have a government and an opposition and a media who are all on the side of saying nothing can be done, or things can be done, but it's not urgent, let's wait till 2050 and see where we are then. Because you've got that sort of monolithic piece of opinion, we look like crazy radicals, And I had someone say to me the other day, I was talking about the fact that all the various ICAC models are just talking shops. There'll be a lot of finger waving and pointing and stuff like that, but nothing will get done, as opposed to our model, which will actually have power to prosecute and imprison people. And this person said to me, well, yeah, but yours is not realistic. Now, what does that mean? It's not realistic. It's perfectly realistic, and it's founded in good law and good policy and a good understanding of how the legal system can and might work if given proper resources. Why is it unrealistic? Well, it's unrealistic because everybody else is saying the same thing. And when I say everybody else, unfortunately, it's not just Labor and Liberals, but it's also Greens. It's also, the Simon Holmes à Court funded independents. They all want to have talking shops for their ICACs. They all want to do net zero emissions by 2050. No, that's not fair. The Greens don't say that. But the independents do, and Labor and Liberal do. If we can get to 2045 and still have a planet, I'll be amazed. So that report that you're talking about, Martin, I mean, it's just irrelevant how learned it is. It's just irrelevant who's authored it. I mean, Steve Keen is one of the greatest economists in the world, and he's put together a piece of real, original thinking to come up with this housing affordability. Now some other country, some country like Finland is going to grab it and they'll run with it, because it makes perfect sense. But here, we just have Murdoch and Labor and Liberals and the Hollywood stars of Simon Holmes à Court, and they're all dancing about saying nothing. You have a learned reporter, or you have a political party that wants to do something, you tend to be a bit of a voice crying in the wilderness. And I might just add that this is what's it's kind of funny, because when I was talking right at the beginning about the possibility of us winning 3 or 4 lower house seats, we're not going to win those 3 or 4 lower house seats because we have what I would say in all humility is excellent policies that can do a lot for this country. We're going to win those seats because we're getting out and chatting to people on the hustings about their cats and their kids, and giving balloons to their kids, and having some fun and singing and dancing and stuff like that. But if that's the only way that we can get into the parliament and start, flexing some blackmail muscle at the parties that are in there that hold government, then that's what we'll do.
Very good.
Sorry, a bit of a rant there, but
no.
anyway.
I think a rant is good, particularly on that particular.
I'm going to add one point to the rant, and that is that the way that conventional parties are looking at it is this is an optimisation problem. You don't want to spend too much money fixing up climate change, otherwise you'll spend more than you should.
Yeah,
and that's exactly what Winston Churchill said, of course, when he was facing invasion by the Nazis. We shall negotiate with them on the beaches.
yeah.
It's an existential crisis. Unless you throw everything you've got at it, you end up speaking German in the Second World War. You end up having the breakdown of human society and climate change. And that's what's not accepted, not realised, because, unfortunately, the politicians have accepted the framing of the economists. So you're mentioning that report, the recent IPCC, and it's quite important, and it does make those warnings. But you read the economics chapter, and what did the economists tell us? They tell us that if we don't do something about climate change, then by 2100, the economy could be between 10 and 23% smaller than it would be in the absence of climate change. Now, that would be an economy 4 or 5 times the size of what we have now, because they're assuming a rate of growth of 3% pretty much per year. So you're going to double, and half double. So they're saying, rather than being 5 times as big as it would, it'll be 4.5, and that's a tragedy. And the economists look at 4.5 versus 5, somebody else's problem. Okay? And you're not seeing it as an existential risk. Now, what the thing is, the climate couldn't give a stuff what the economists think. It will be existential. And then what's going to happen is people saying, holy hell, what's the disconnect going on here? I've noticed one of the previous comments is, what about moving people to higher ground? Have you seen the photograph of the McDonald's in Lismore? Know that photograph?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. The sign is about 8 metres below sea level, water level. And that was, McDonald's was built purposefully on a high region of Lismore, where they thought that the base level would not be flooded. And it's 8 metres below water level. So when you've got this scale of climatic drama coming our way, you can't move out of the way of it. It's coming for you. And we're saying that's what we see. We see it as an existential crisis, an existential risk, not something we need to minimise the costs of fighting it. We have to simply stop it. So we've gone for what was virtually impossible. But if you don't try the impossible, you won't you won't do what's feasible. And that is to aim for net zero by 2030, not 2050.
Yeah, and can I add in there, Steve, and Martin, that on that, we will negotiate with them on the beaches and so on. I mean, did anybody say to Winston Churchill when he said we'll fight them on the beach, how are you going to do that? And how many rifles do you have? And tell me exactly how many bullets you've got. And will you go up that hill or will you sit at the bottom of the hill?
And what about the budget? What about the budget?
And where will we get the money to do that, Winston? And here's a story. This is not apocryphal. This is God's honest truth, right? So I'm out there on the hustings and a woman comes up to me and she says, what's your policy on climate? And I say, well, we're in a climate emergency. We want net zero emissions by 2030. How are you going to do that? Well, I said, we've set it all out on the website. Steve Keen and others have drafted this, some very fine scientists and so on. You can read it there. And I said, if you want me to talk about it here, we could be here for the next 5 hours, but it doesn't really matter because some of the things we're suggesting won't work and we'll have to do other things and we'll have to fund entrepreneurs and we'll have to chop and change and we'll have to swap around. But it's a war and, we're going to get out there and we're going to fight it because we have to fight it because we're in a climate emergency. We're in a war. We're on a war footing. And she said, well, that's not good enough. Tell me about one area. And I don't know why I picked this. And I said, well, in agriculture, which is the hardest one to, in the past, to show how you'll make strides towards net zero emissions. They're actually making strides with some of the methane that's being exuded by the cattle and all that sort of thing. And she says, well, what are they doing? And I said, well, they've got a form of injection and they inject the cattle and this reduces the methane that the cattle are putting out. And she says, what's the formula of the injection? I said, lady, I'm a politician and a barrister. I'm not a chemist. I don't know. Well, she said, that's not good enough. You purport to lead a party, you don't know what the formula is for. So if people want to say you can't do it, they're going to say you can't do it.
You can't win them all, mate, by the sounds of that one. God almighty.
Oh, yeah. So it gives you the sort of thing when everybody else is saying, oh, we can do it by 2050, that'll be fine. Let's start thinking about it in another 10 years and so on. Yeah.
Right, okay. Now, let me take the conversation on a little bit because, of course, there's an energy policy question as well, which is segueing from climate change, but more broadly. And just by way of introduction, this is the world WTI futures, right? So basically it went up to 130. It's now back down to 98 when I took the shot. And, of course, there's been a massive panic because of the oil price, and they're obviously blaming Ukraine, and then of course they're also saying, well, China is potentially have a COVID wave come through, so they're perhaps going to use less in the way of oil. The whole energy question seems to be up in the air. The UK is saying, well, we may have to actually drill more in the North Sea and use oil and do more nuclear. What's your thoughts with regard to energy policy? And has anything that's happened over the last 3 months changed your policy view?
I think it's interesting if you look at somewhere like Norway. So they are so far down the path towards a green economy and the net zero emissions by 2030 that they're aiming at. That is really, really encouraging. But they're still selling their gas everywhere, aren't they? So it is a very difficult question. I think that when you fight a war, because we are not of an economic view that every dollar that's spent is a knife through the heart of the populace because it's a cost we can't afford because, oh my God, we might not have a surplus. Because we're not like that. We don't need to worry too much about saying, well, we need to invest in this and we need to invest in that. And as a sovereign government, we can do that. But like in any war, there's going to be casualties and, we have to get away from fossil fuel and that's our policy. And I just don't think that we can afford to take a backward step on that. Martin, it's it would be wrong and hypocritical to say, we are going to fight a war. We're going to do everything necessary. Oh, hang on. maybe we'll sell a bit of coal anyway, or maybe we'll sell a bit of oil anyway. Like we just can't do that. And we hope that through careful investment and redeployment of assets and redeployment of people whose jobs might be at risk, we will minimise the pain. But for goodness sake, if we have to have a little pain so we have a planet to live on, then we have to have a little pain. You've got to have the inoculation.
Yeah.
Some people think you don't. But anyway, another bad analogy.
Look, the point is that we're damaging the ecosphere in so many different ways. Okay, not just what we're doing with carbon, but the one that's causing the most dramatic changes overall is pumping in more carbon dioxide, which retains more of the sun's energy. So, like putting a lid on a pot of soup on the stove. Okay, you change the whole pattern of circulation, and that then undermines the relatively stable pot we've been on for the last 12,000 years, and you look at the long-term history of humanity, we only evolved sedentary civilizations over the last 12,000 years. You had remarkable stability in the temperature for that period of time. We're now blasting it out of that stability faster than it's ever happened before. And what that then means is, put the lid on the pot, the pot boils much more rapidly. All the patterns you were relying upon aren't there anymore. And if you have things which depend upon that pattern, like agriculture, like where people live, that gets destroyed. And you can't have that stability anymore, and therefore you have a breakdown of civilization. That's the way we need to look at it. And what that means is we simply have to stop pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that means we have to get rid of the 80% or more of the generation of our energy coming from fossil fuels. Now, if you don't do it quickly, if you don't do it by policy, you'll be forced by reality at some point, because that temperature is, the floods we saw in Lismore, the floods we saw in Germany, the fires in Australia in the previous summer, the ones in California, all these effects are going to get just more and more calamitous. And at some point, going to say, oh, damn, we just lost the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that hasn't happened. We can't blame that on the weather. What the hell do we do? And you've got to then drastically reduce your energy consumption when you're not prepared for it. We're saying do it as fast as possible. Move over to renewable energy as quickly as possible. Consider other options too. We have to reduce the extent to which we use fossil fuels to generate energy.
Yep, absolutely. Well, very interesting. And again, the point is you have policy around this, right? And it's important that people actually get to understand that this isn't just a high-level idea. There's actually thought behind it.
Well, in fact, this is one of the most fascinating, pardon me, Victor, one of the most fascinating things in the study, which I had no hand in, is we had 3 people who put the policy together, and 2 of them are experts on hydrology in Australia. And they pointed out that we could actually engineer an inland lake by desalinating with solar power at both the South Australia and Queensland, travelling by a very short distance, and then measured in hundreds of kilometres, not the thousands the country actually has. And then that water would then flow downwards towards Lake Eyre and give us an internal water reservoir, which could change the microclimate from a macroclimate of Australia. And it's that sort of thinking which is informing us. It isn't just let's cut out fossil fuels and that's fairly much wish list stuff. The people who are involved in writing our policy include serious scientists and serious geologists who know the structure of the planet, the country, and can say these are some of the active things we can do. In the government, we could actually achieve this, and this is nation building stuff. It's not the neoliberal garbage of abolish the government, everything's going to be wonderful that both our opponents, Labor and Liberal, both espouse.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, let me put this question to you both now. This is from Sean. What is the optimal population for Australia?
See, this question, with all due respect to Sean, has an assumption built into it, and that is that Australia is static and that its resources are static and that its water is static. And Steve's just made the point that with a little bit of creativity, you can make the desert bloom as they did in Israel. Now, it's a very different scenario here, but, an internal lake, desalination that can instead of forcing people to stop cropping cotton in the desert, which is a crazy thing but is actually profitable, a little bit of modern technology utilising desalination would enable them to continue with that crazy thing and still make export sales and enable the southern farmers to actually have some water instead of having it all stolen from them. So the optimal population depends on the technology and the vision of the people that are forming the nation to come, So people talk about big Australia and small Australia. I think they are nonsense terms. They talk in terms of we can afford to have 25 million or 30 million or whatever they say we can afford to have, but that's based on looking at Australia as it is. If it turns out that we can't make any more of Australia arable than it is, then I think, we're probably quite close to the maximal population that we would want. But if, let's say, at the other extreme, if this were possible, and I think it is, we could turn this continent into a continent like America where you had fertile lands from one coast to the other, then the optimal population would be something significantly greater than that.
I have to say, overall, we believe humanity has exceeded the carrying capacity of the planet, and therefore, in the aggregate, we want to see the human population fall.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, they may be redistributed around the planet in a different way, and at the moment, we certainly can't take in anything like. We were already stressing the biosphere with the amount exporting, not just domestically, of course, but through our food exports. And if we find we can't sustain that, then you have a very different population pattern. I think we have to be looking at reducing the number of humans. We've forgotten there are other species on the planet, and that's a problem. We forget them completely; they disappear. Who can you eat if there aren't any other animals? We have to seriously consider our position in an overall ecological pattern, and we've completely ignored that, and we're now paying for it. So the overall pattern is there has to be less humans and more space on the planet for other species. That's the overall framing.
Yeah, and can I add in that I was talking before about theoretical possibilities, because I think you need to say that because there is no definitive answer about what is the optimal population. But if we are looking at it now, our policy, if we are asking what is the optimal population right now, then our policy is to do the absolute reverse of what the government's been doing. What the government's been doing, particularly under Peter Dutton, has been, spending about $4 billion a year on legal fees to ensure that every one of the potential 20,000 asylum seekers gets sent home and doesn't get any protection in Australia, whilst indiscriminately allowing all sorts of immigration of other types, when we don't necessarily have the carrying capacity for those extra people, particularly into the cities. We want to reverse that. We want to look very carefully at the other side of the immigration quotient and make sure that the people we bring in are limited in number to the people that will do the best for Australia with their skills. And on the other hand, if people are refugees, if they are desperate, if they are calling for our help, we want to give them that help. What we're saying is that the current situation is the exact reverse of logic. It's the reverse of good microeconomics, and it's the reverse of humanity. We want to turn all that around.
Visionary stuff, guys. Visionary stuff. Thank you. Now let me go from the sublime to the ridiculous. This is one from Alan. Guy Debelle leaving the RBA. Is this significant or not, Steve?
Not particularly. Guy's not a bad bloke, but he's just I think he's decided there's no future for him inside the RBA, so he's going to go and work in the private sector. And the firm he's chosen, Fortescue, with Ziggy Forrest, has a strong emphasis upon decarbonising Australia, which is a good thing. So I wish him the best in all that. But in terms of whether we've lost an important intellect who could otherwise have saved us from economic ruin, no, I'm not particularly worried about that issue.
Okay, good. Next. Thank you for that one. Okay, this is one from Colin. There's been a lot of talk about manufacturing in Australia, making our own stuff because of the supply chain disruptions, and it's clear that it's shown that there are a lot of issues in terms of having those long supply chains. So what's the New Liberals' policy with regard to manufacturing and how you'd actually start to kickstart it, if in fact that's what you want to do?
Well, can I say that's what we want to do? I mean, Steve makes the point regularly that our manufacturing capacity is now, I think, about 80th in the world, and we are below Zimbabwe and Gabon. And that is not acceptable. And no clever country ever abandons all its manufacturing to rely on primary resources. I mean, it's a no-brainer, surely. And so, yes, we want to, and let me hand over to Steve, who will tell you how we'll go about it.
Yep. Okay, well, I'll bring up that particular point that Victor's mentioning there. So again, here I go to your share screen once more. And I'll find the right one. Why can I not see it? Let's go the whole. Hang on. Pardon me. Here we go. That's it. Okay. So this is the chart, what's called the Atlas of Economic Complexity, which is maintained by data engineers rather than economists. There's a couple of economists involved, but it's mainly data people at Harvard University. And what they show is, you go back to 1995, which is when this data begins. Australia was ranked 55th in the world, and the country I'm currently sitting in, Thailand, was number 50. So even back then, we had a less complex economy than Thailand has. Fast forward, we go from number 55 to 86. And over that period of time, Cambodia, which was way down at the 117th most complex manufacturing sector in the world, is now 88. So we're 2 steps above Cambodia. We focus upon, and the very good role that Malcolm Fraser took in taking in Cambodian refugees after the Vietnam invasion and the whole Pol Pot period. But they've done more to build their nation. We've deconstructed what they've constructed. So this, first of all, says you have to, we've done it because we're focused upon primary exports, as Victor said, rather than producing our own goods. We have to break away from that. And one way you can do it is actually using the same intelligence here, because what they show is you can then build a mathematical model of the relationship of one industry to another. So I know those dots will be hard to see on the screen, but you can tell there's a lot more colour in this one than there is in this one. This is Australia's industrial pattern. This is Germany's. And what you find is successful countries have diversified industrial structures. So we want to go not for specialisation, but for diversification. And then what you can do as well, and again, this is the same intelligence coming out of Harvard, is that you can, if you have 2 industries which are in close proximity, then it's possible to build a third with those 2 as the foundation. My favourite example is sailboarding. Sailboarding combines sails and the surfboards. So if you have both a sail industry and a surfboard industry in your country, you're more likely to produce that new industry by combining the 2. So it's that, and that is again a guide that comes out of this Harvard University research. So we'd be looking at that as a fundamental idea. The other is a lot of raw materials processing. We currently export raw materials unprocessed. One of the biggest raw materials we have is lithium. We're the world's 2nd largest deposits of lithium. Obviously, it's going to rise with battery technology. We should be making the batteries. Okay, that's a feasible part of us for being in the international supply chain for renewable energy. So there's a whole range of things we can build in our resources the way that Norway has done, and use that resource advantage to build an industrial structure, rather than what we've done, which is use that resource structure to say we don't need the industry, we can import it all. And of course, in a world of global warming and climate change, we're seeing how much supply chains get disrupted. If you can't make it, you don't get it. So we have to make it locally, and that's a major focus of our overall policy.
And that presumably means that you need to be able to kickstart new businesses and provide an investment platform for growing businesses. But it also presumably means that the private sector, the banks in particular, need to be able to finance and funnel their finance into those sectors, because at the moment, going back to your earlier charts, the proportion of bank lending to business has gone through the floor, hasn't it, relative to home lending?
Oh yeah, it's all going to the household sector and to the household bubble. So we want to make it impossible for banks to profit out of house price bubbles. Okay? A major part of our policy is what we call the PIL, which stands for Property Income Limited Leverage, and that would mean that you could no longer borrow 20 and 30 times the rental income of a property to buy it. We'd start off with where it currently is, which is about 20 to 1, and reduce that over time down to 10 to 1, meaning that there was no longer the huge encouragement for people to borrow money in the first place. And then also banks would no longer have that as a profitable business line. So if banks want to operate, they have to lend to companies, to entrepreneurs, to communities, rather than lending as they do right now to the house price bubble. And then also we would want to have government spending on a scale which creates a sufficient deficit to create the money the private sector needs, which would give you the actual cash in people's bank accounts rather than having to borrow that money from the bank. So if you look back in the 50s and 60s, there was more business startups back then than now, because there was so much more money, government money created and in circulation, that you could, out of that cash flow, you could start a business. Well, at the moment, the only way is to go to cap in hand to the banks. And what do they tell you? What's your house worth? That's the only way you get a housing, you get a loan for a business. So start enabling industry to be built on the foundations of our resources, rebuild the skill structure. We've completely de-skilled the workforce. That's not how you build a complex society. Reskill the workforce and then provide finance. Venture capital, in some sense, is one useful way for the government to finance this. You literally put some money into ventures, knowing that some of it's going to fail. But if the money is being created, then even if they fail, they've stimulated some other part of the economy. So provide, the government providing not venture capital in terms of wanting a return, but venture capital and not mattering if the business itself doesn't work, because you'll start 6 businesses, 1 will succeed. And that is the approach to enable new businesses to arise.
And one question that follows from that is, does that mean we have to change the Bank for International Settlement rules with regard to the capital ratios for mortgage lending versus lending to businesses?
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, one of the mistakes I was thinking, one of my very good friends internationally is Bill White, who was the research director of the Bank of International Settlements. I'm the only person in formal position who warned of the financial crisis before it happened. I remember reading a BIS report back in 2006 and being, this will be a load of shit, in my usual attitude. I mean, holy hell, I would have been proud to write this. I was surprised. So I finally met Bill. And so we became good friends. And he said, when he saw the Basel rules come across, he said, the Basel rules, when they came across my desk, my heart sank. And what he could see was, by declaring households with safe assets to lend to, it was going to encourage the housing bubble even further. We have to get away from that. And so we want you to take risks, and we want you to be putting money where it can actually create new businesses, not where it creates asset bubbles.
But that obviously has the follow-on observation then that the international finance system has been built in a way that's biased towards home investment and building rather than anything else.
Yeah. I mean, and it isn't the regulators who caused the whole thing, but it certainly added to it. I mean, I highly recommend anybody who wants to know how banking actually operates to read A Brief History of Doom by Richard Vague. Okay, and Richard is a billionaire. He won't tell me how many billionaires worth. He's a good friend, but he's like a lot of billionaires. He keeps his cards close to his chest. He made money out of starting 2 credit card systems in America, and then an energy system as well. And now he's focused on the role of private debt in causing economic crises. But he says when there's a lending boom going on, everybody lends into the same thing. And you were back in the 80s when he was there, it was oil, and the fact that caused a crash in Texas is what let him start his first major consumer lending system. But fundamentally, if you give them encouragements, they'll rush into them. And they rushed into oil in the 80s, and they rushed into housing in the 90s. And we want them to rush into manufacturing. Thanks very much.
Exactly right. Now, here's a very important question. This is from Jenny. There's appears to be a surge of minor parties that are actually queuing up to fight the next election. And she's asking two sides to the question. One is, why do you think there's been such a proliferation in minor parties? And the second part of the question, and does it matter which minor party you actually vote for, or are they all the same anyway?
Over to you, Vic.
Yeah. First of all, Jenny, there hasn't been a proliferation of minor parties. There have always been a number of minor parties. The reason you're hearing about them is because Labor and Liberal got together and passed some legislation that made it very difficult for the minor parties to continue to exist. So a lot of them are going out of business, and you're hearing that now, but they've all been around for a long, long time. And typically they don't have much of an impact on the political system at all. What there has been a proliferation of is independent candidates, and springing out of what's called the Voices of movement. And that started back with the Voices for Indi. Indi was a Victorian country electorate that had a very unpopular Liberal incumbent in Sophie Mirabella, and people had been voting Liberal kind of by default for a long, long time. A group of people got together there, and they decided that they'd work out what people really wanted, and that they would start building something from the ground upwards. And they had what they called kitchen table meetings. And in those kitchen table meetings, they talked about what was wanted. They grew in numbers. They got a candidate in Cathy McGowan, and they actually beat the Liberal incumbent. And when Cathy McGowan retired, her successor, also a Liberal, Helen Haines, took over from that. And that was quite inspiring for a lot of people. So all across the country, Voices for movements grew up. And one of the most startling successes, of course, was that movement in the seat of Warringah in Sydney, where Zali Steggall defeated former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Now, Simon Holmes à Court, who's a billionaire, has encouraged lots of people to put money together to fund other independents on the model of those two. So you see a lot of them around. Beyond them, the only parties that really have a chance of winning seats are, of course, the Labor and Liberal Party. The Greens have, in some areas, have lost ground, in New South Wales, for example, but in Victoria have gained ground, and are likely to win 2 or 3 seats down in inner Melbourne, beyond the one they've got in Adam Bandt, their leader. And the rise of ourselves, where we are looking at the possibility, as I've mentioned earlier, if we're fortunate of winning 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 seats. That's the only people that are going to win lower house seats. Clive Palmer is running candidates across the nation, but he will never get more than 3 or 4% because he's appealing to a very narrow demographic of people who kind of want to wear bullhorns and storm the Capitol, you know. So he's not going to win seats. Pauline Hanson has and will win seats in the Senate, but not in the lower house. So it might look like a proliferation of parties, but it's a movement that's coming from several directions. As I say in summary, ourselves, the Independents, and the Greens. But the really interesting thing is that that might very well result in a crossbench of somewhere between 14 and 18 people. So a minority government that is very, very much a minority government and needs to negotiate with people and needs to have some concern about what the people of Australia want. In terms of does it matter who you vote for with the minor parties, I think that yes, it does. Don't vote for Clive Palmer. He invests $100 million in every election to funnel votes to the LNP so that he can help keep them in power, so that he can rely on them to keep supporting his fossil fuel ambitions. Don't vote for him. I think that if you're looking at a seat like the one I'm running in North Sydney, obviously, if you were a North Sydney resident, I'd want you to vote for me. But I'd have to say that if you voted for the independent or you voted for the Greens candidate, and you were instrumental in getting rid of the incumbent Liberal candidate, any one of those results would be better. Almost anybody is better than almost every Liberal incumbent, because whether they are a good person or a nice person. In fact, the Liberal incumbent in our seat is a very popular man and is known to be a nice fellow. But he still votes for all the terrible things that the government votes for, because he's part of that government and that's his job. And you can't blame him for that. But if you want to get rid of all those terrible things, you've got to get rid of him. So the simple answer, I would say, is vote. Like, say you're sitting in North Sydney, Jenny, and you think that, you know, the independent's the very best choice and the Greens is the next best and I'm the next best after that. Okay, vote for us in that order. But whatever you do, put the LNP last. Because if you put the LNP last, that is the only way in our preferential voting system that you can guarantee that the LNP will not get your preference at some stage in the distribution of preferences. Sorry, long-winded answer, but it was kind of a complex question. Good question.
No. I mean, I think that's important. And the whole idea of understanding how the preference system works, yes, and making sure that you put down the bottom end, the ones you really don't want to win, that's really important, right? So use the preference system to your benefit.
Yes. Well, what the real danger is that many people who don't understand the preference system say they're voting in North Sydney and they've been Liberal voters all their lives. I'm meeting dozens of people that say this every day, but I'm not. I've been a Liberal voter all my life. I'm not voting Liberal this time. Okay, good. Then choose who you're going to vote for. Let's say you choose to vote for the Greens. You put them number one, but don't put the Liberals number two, because there's a real chance that the Greens will be eliminated in the preferential system and your vote will flow onto the person you don't want to vote for. So the only way to be safe is to vote for your preferred candidates at the top, and the candidate that you don't want to see elected very last. And in my humble opinion, that should always be the LNP.
Very good.
And to bring the Senate in here as well, the Senate has a different pattern, so you don't have to vote for every party anymore. There used to be the horror with the old tablecloth election, but now you're required to vote for either 6 parties above the line or 12 individuals below the line. And that means that you can actually not even put the Liberal Party down. And that's what we'd recommend. So vote 6, we'd prefer you to put the first preference for the New Liberals, me in New South Wales, Bess in Queensland and so on. Put the Greens in there, put the Progressive Independents, put Labor. I'd suggest putting Labor as your 6th preference, because we do want to have a lot of capacity for the independents and party like ours to pressure Labor to be progressive in its policies rather than getting it slaughtered back and pushed back into being neoliberal. But put them Labor 6 and then don't bother with the Liberals. Don't even need to list them. So that way they won't get. They won't even get your last preference. Give them no preference at all. Okay. So first the New Liberals, second the Greens. We haven't actually worked this out, but that's what we would all prefer. Other independents, Labor.
Okay, thanks for that. All right, now I want to move on. There are 2 last questions I want to cover. The first is this, and this came in from a number of people, so I won't mention anybody in their name, but it's specifically this question of the fact that it looks as though ScoMo is playing the khaki election card, right? So basically saying, you know, defence is where this is all up. We're going to throw a lot of money at defence. We're in an uncertain world. What you can't do is to, disturb the status quo in this environment. So the question is defence and, all of the warmongering basically a distraction, a misdirection, or what's going on? How do you read it?
I read it as what they do at every election. They do something in the hope of drawing the Labor Party out into saying something that the Murdoch press can then annihilate them for. And this is why the Labor Party has, unfortunately, turned themselves into a clone of the LNP. So on the basis that if they agree with everything and vote with everything that the government does, then Murdoch might leave them alone. And, you know, it's a Faustian deal that will bring them undone, but you can understand where it's coming from. And so as I understand Albanese's statements, once again, he's just agreeing with the government. So Murdoch will not be able to slaughter him. So the government's saying, well, you know, we'll rattle sabres at China. And Albanese says, well, we'll rattle sabres at China too. Really is a nil-sum game. So it's just classic. It's the oldest political trick in the book. It goes back to well beyond ancient Greece, where you say, in any democracy, you say to the people who might vote for you, here's something to fear, and guess what? We'll protect you from it. And that's and if both sides say the same thing, then I don't think it's going to have much impact on the outcome of the election.
I think it's very important, though, that ScoMo dresses up as a general somewhere and presses a button on something. I mean, you know, if cosplay was what you needed, and we've got the best Prime Minister on the bloody planet. He can cut your hair, he can fly a plane. I actually saw him with a bloody captain's out in a bloody plane. Can you imagine? ScoMo's at the controls. I mean, what a joke. We're going to get subs in 2040, which will be great for the conflict they expect to have with China in 2030. You know, I mean, the whole idea that these guys are competent at anything is just beyond a joke. So, yeah, khaki.
Yeah, and the point is it's largely a misdirection, right? Because they can't now claim to be good economic managers with the inflation running through the roof and interest rates probably going to rise and the cost of living going, you know, ever higher. So they're running out of cards to play, really. So this is the one that looks the most likely to win.
Yeah, pretty much. It's trivia, and I'd be incredibly embarrassed if Australians fall for it.
Well, and again, I mean, I'm out on the hustings and people talk to me about many things. They express their opinions on many things. They ask questions on many things, but not a soul mentions that. So I don't think it is going to be a driver for votes.
Very good. Now let's go on to the last one, and this is one which I deliberately left to the end because I didn't want to spend the whole time discussing it. But what's your opinion on what caused the Ukraine crisis, and what does this tell us about the international relations that we have with China and with, you know, the US and the whole web of international politics?
I might be just simplistic here, and please, anybody correct me. But I think what caused the Ukraine crisis is what's caused every invasion of every nation by every other nation. You get a leader who lusts for power and gains power in his own domestic realm, and that isn't good enough for his lust. So he has to push it further. I don't think there's anything sophisticated or particularly modern about this. He's no different from Genghis Khan or Hitler or, you know, Mark Antony or anybody else. You know, he just wants to be more powerful. Would you agree, Steve?
I'll elaborate, because if you want to see what caused Putin to rise, it's America, and that was because they saw the collapse of the Berlin Wall not as a chance to bring Russia into the Western fold, but to crush Russia. And twofold. Partly was driven by absolutely stupid economic policy, what they called shock therapy. And this is a whole bunch of economists saying that you don't want to go gradually from a socialist economy to a market one. You want to go there cold turkey. And that's literally one of the phrases you'll find in some of the academic literature. Jeffrey Sachs, in one of his papers, and Jeffrey's now embarrassed that this can be said back to him. He's changed his politics quite radically, and he's now quite a progressive at the expense of having his policies tested in Russia. He wrote at one stage, if the British wanted to change from right-hand drive to left-hand drive, should they do it gradually by making the trucks move on day one and the cars on day two? In other words, that's the sort of crappy analogy people were using in academic papers. Now, the Chinese had the same nonsense put to them by the Americans, but because they hadn't been wiped out in the fashion that Russia was, they said their analogy was, we want to cross a river, and you cross a river carefully, feeling for stone by stone on the floor of the river. And of course, look at the outcome. Russia and China were much the same level of economic per capita income in 1990. Now China's about 5 times Russia's level. So China's approach worked, and China was in control. The Russians were driven by Americans pushing what they call shock therapy, incredibly fast transition. It meant that the mafia took over. The ownership fell from, rather than going to the public, growing your own local capital slowly, which is what the Chinese did. You had the mafia, which was an essential part of the Soviet system functioning beforehand, plus the managers of the factories and the upper arches of the Communist Party. They became the oligarchs. They gave us the oligarch structure. And then you had a fumbling fool of Yeltsin. And this is when Putin came through. He saw his opportunity, and this brings back to what Victor was saying, that he could raise himself over the farce of Yeltsin by suppressing Chechnya. And he did it by carpet bombing the place. And that gave him the strongman impression, which is what gave him got him to the top of the Russian Empire. But that's one side. The other is that NATO, again, rather than saying, let's bring Russia into the fold, Putin at one point, you'll find on YouTube saying he actually approached Clinton about Russia joining NATO and got a very cold shoulder. Now, instead, NATO's continued encroaching towards Russia, and this means Russia has hostile countries on its border. And the last country that faced that was a little country called America with Cuba and the missile crisis. So that led to the threats to invade Cuba. If you're a major power like that, you don't want hostile nations on your border. So the sensible thing NATO would be not to expand, to accept having a neutral range of countries between it and Russia, but instead NATO continued expanding out. And so this is what led to the provocation. So at this stage, I'm saying I can understand why Putin was pushing and saying, I don't want NATO there, but he completely overplayed his hand by going in and thinking he could just obliterate the Ukraine. And that, if it had been left to the Donbas region and stuff like that, and saying we want to, grab that section, which is mainly Russian population, and then have a buffer there, and then force you not to join NATO, etc., I could have understood that as a real politic thing. Instead, he tries to subjugate the country. That's a huge mistake, and he's now paying for it. And of course, we're paying for it. The world is paying for it as well in terms of destroying the stability of the political system. So America had a huge role in bringing this about, both in how it damaged the Russian economy and how it gave the potential for somebody like Putin to rise into power. And then it seems that NATO was also provoking this. So that's me to the main worry. We've actually helped create this beast.
Look, I would agree with that 100%. I think that's a brilliant analysis of the causes. But there's a school of historians, as you'd know, Steve, they talk about the great man theory of history. And that would say that, yes, they were all the causes, but with a person different from Putin, the step of invading the Ukraine still wouldn't have happened. I agree with that. I mean, you need both of them. Yeah, you
need both. Like that was a huge miscalculation by Putin. That it appears it's partly he's living, in a very buffered system inside the Kremlin. People tell him what he wants to hear because they don't dare tell him what he doesn't want to hear.
Yeah.
I'll give you my favourite example of that. I reading Soviet literature back when I was a student. I thought I should read some Stalin to see what Stalin was actually like. And there's a book called Problems of Communism, and it's a very sober analysis of the state of Roman society up to a particular phrase. And I still remember vividly reading this in Fisher Library in Sydney University. It said, all the preceding is irrelevant. Russian industry is advancing in leaps and bounds. Anyone who does not believe this is a sworn enemy of the Russian people. Well, holy fuck, if you were a Russian statistician and you read that, you're about to report there's a failure of the wheat crop in Ukraine, you instead report a huge wheat crop in Ukraine, which therefore leads Stalin to export wheat from Ukraine, expecting there's plenty of surplus, and the Ukrainians starve to death. So this misinformation system also seems to be behind what Putin has done, because he believed he had an effective military. He believed the Ukrainians would not resist. Both wrong.
Thank you for that. And it is very interesting getting that nuance from you, Steve, in particular, in terms of the historical perspective. But I guess there's a natural follow-on question, which is, well, if we've got NATO and the US engaging with Russia, does that mean that China is basically going to have opportunity to sort of do its own thing and think of Taiwan and those sorts of things? I mean, are we going to make the same mistake twice?
Well, I think Russia, I hope the Chinese are looking at what's happened to Russia going into Ukraine and thinking, wow, and that's with a land border. What happens if we try Taiwan with a land border with a primitive military, which we thought was primitive, certainly not one on the scale we need to. What Taiwan's got with the compact they've had with America for all those years, Korea as well, South Korea. No, you do not go there. Rattle the sabers, but don't cross the strait. I think that might be the Chinese reaction. But overall, definitely this, Russia's coming out of this weakened. America's coming out of this compromised. I think China's capacity to influence is going to grow.
Well, our Dr. Richard Hames, who might know, Martin, is our senior policy advisor on foreign affairs and has advised a lot of world leaders, including one or two people very high up in the Chinese government, is very firmly of the view that they don't have an intention to invade anybody, and they don't think they need to invade anybody because they can dominate us in so many other ways. Now, I've got to respect that, but I do agree with Steve that if they were toying with the idea of some sort of military action, the upside of the Ukraine thing is they will see the dangers. I think they're probably not as crazy dictator-like as Putin, but who knows? They seem to be a little more measured in their thinking, realistic in their thinking.
I've had some friends who work in China who say that Xi has got the emperor complex, which you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, okay.
And some of my friends spend their time watching Chinese presentations, scoring how many times Xi gets mentioned and how many photographs Xi gets, and they then give their Chinese, when they go for a drink afterwards, they score their Chinese compatriots on this point score, and the Chinese snortle, chuckle, because the foreigners can say that we can't, but they acknowledge that's the situation. So he is the most dominant Chinese leader since Mao. But at the same time, China, even when you look historically, it worked on a tribute system. It didn't work on an invasion system. And that's a very, very different way to approaching dominance. They still want dominance, but they don't necessarily want to install their own puppets, which is what America and Russia have both done.
Okay, well, thanks for that, folks. Well, look, we've come pretty much to the end of our time. So before we close out, is there anything specific that either of you wants to spell out to the audience in terms of, the conversation that we've had, or something we haven't had that you want to touch on before we close? Steve?
Sorry, Steve. Go ahead.
I think, Victor, you'll get the last word, mate. First of all, fund us, please. We have no funding worth speaking of. We're only working on GoFundMe campaigns and things like that. If you like what Victor and I've had to say and the policies you'll find on the website, and you want those you get into our office, we'll ultimately, if we get in power, we'll ban political donations, but now we need them desperately. Otherwise, we can't function. So please go to our websites, look for the donation button, help out me, help out our candidates, help out the party as a whole. Tell your friends. Get this. We're not going to get much media coverage. Try word of mouth, okay? and bore them shitless. Okay. We need to lobby as much as possible to have any chance to penetrate the wall of money that dominates Australian politics. Victor, final word to you, mate.
My final word is ditto. I was going to say exactly the same thing. There you are.
I'll say one thing here, and this is I've got to know Victor very well over the last few months, and you want somebody who's got the empathy which you see in the person you've been listening to today. He's the real deal.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to say thanks to both of you, Victor and to Steve, for spending time with us tonight. I know you've got a really busy time on all sorts of ways, and that you're able to carve out the time is brilliant. We've had a good set of comments on the chat and a good number on the show. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts so openly and transparently. I continue to wish you well in the initiatives ahead, because it's, we're not quite sure when the date is, but it's coming up. It's definitely coming, right? So it's not long now. And, all power to your elbow. And what I take away from both listening to you both is, one, you've got a set of thought out policies, which is brilliant, but you're also very down to earth as well and realistic. And I think that's really important.
Thank you so much, Martin. I really appreciate your support as always. And it's just great fun talking to you.
Indeed.
Great. Thanks. And good luck to you both. And Steve, good luck with your results. And I hope they work out the right way for you. So
thank you, guys.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'm going to take you offline and I'll just close the show.
Yep.
See ya. So there you go, folks. Very interesting conversation from Victor and Steve. Very, very powerful thoughts there. And before I go, let me just tell you that next week, a bit of a change of tune. We're going to be talking about property with Chris Bates, looking at, I've misspelled his name, Chris Bates, with looking specifically at Sydney property, but more broadly as well with all the data that's coming out at the moment. So join us for that. And before we go, we will just take one last look at the doggy cam. They haven't moved. They've been there the whole time. So there you go. The dogs are sound asleep. Clearly, they think that the show's over. So it must be true. So thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you found it informative. Go check those links out. I've put them in the comments below. And, do support the New Liberals and what they're trying to do. This is a really important opportunity to make a difference to Australia. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. We'll see you next time. Cheerio.